for having me. It's nice to be back with you, and it's nice to see if we can sort this out again. Talk tonight is on Cambridge at War 1939 to 1945, and I don't know why I'm giving it, because there are lots of you who know far more about the Second World War than I do, and there's a lot of people who know far more about Cambridge than I do. But I'm going to share some things that may make you think. Now, you can sort of say, well, why talk about Cambridge at war? Because, of course, the war didn't affect Cambridge. We all know, it's always been said that Cambridge was never bombed because Hitler wanted to take Cambridge and have it as a centre of a university. And that's gone down as fact, hasn't it? It's one of those things. Except if you look at that, it says bombs dropped on Cambridge. But hang on, we just said there weren't any bombs dropped on Cambridge. And it also says in retaliation for British bombing attacks on Heidelberg, we dropped bombs on Cambridge. That's something that, don't hear very often. So is there anything in that? So let's have a look at the little bit of Cambridge at war, but to put it in context, we have to go back to the end of the Great War. At the end of the Great War, Cambridge had a collection to erect a war memorial in memory of those men who went and fought and did not return. And that war memorial was the nurses' home at the back of Addenbrooke's Hospital. With money left over, they erected a memorial to victory at the end of the station road. And that memorial to victory has become known as the War Memorial. Well, almost as soon as that memorial had been erected, people were marching, saying no more war. That hope that we would have peace in all our times seemed very unlikely. Here you've got people preparing for war, members of the Cambridgeshire Regiment marching off to camp, marching off with their drums and followed on the road beside them by their families. These families looking proudly at their son who is playing the drums as he marches away to the camp before he marched away to war. Back at the War Memorial, the British Legion standards are draped in the dust. And on the right, the fascist salute is given. We want no more war. In 1937, German airmen came to Mildenhall to inspect the latest British bombers. And at that time, Cambridge was welcoming young children who knew about bombers because they had been bombed in Spain by German bombers. They were refugees from the Spanish Civil War. They were looked after at Pampisford Rectory and later in Cambridge. We knew about the impact of war. In the lead up to what happened next, Herr Hitler met Neville Chamberlain, and they were here in Cambridge. Well, no, not quite. Hitler and Chamberlain shown here alongside mud wrestling at a Cambridge rag. No, Hitler, as far as I know, never came to Cambridge. Chamberlain did. Chamberlain just turned up at the Great St. Mary's Church unexpected. But when he came out, everybody mobbed him because he, of course, was that man who had ensured that with that piece of paper that he'd got with Herr Hitler, that there would be no war. Others tended to disagree. Another prominent politician came to Cambridge, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill came to Cambridge and packed a meeting at the Corn Exchange where undergraduates voted for conscription. Having decided previously that they would not fight for king and country, Cambridge undergraduates would fight for king and country. We wanted no more war, but it's going that way. And then you get to the headlines. The headlines for September the 1st, 1939. Poland invokes treaty with Britain, full-scale attack with German troops. Polish towns bombed from the air But what it doesn't say is it was a Cambridge man who from the Warsaw Embassy building sent the message that told the world that Germany had bombed Poland, which led to the other headlines. Hitler, no choice but force, would seem to mean war. And before war has started, on the front page of the Cambridge paper, there is a photograph of children, Cambridge children, being issued with gas masks. Hang on, issued with gas masks before the war was declared? Yes, because of course in those few months before war, great activities had been undertaken to supply respirators, and people were practicing using them, but already Cambridge scientists were saying they would not work. The mask that would really protect the wearer against known forms of gas would cost more than that little box that we were handing out over here. The other picture on the front page, of course, is of children coming to Cambridge, evacuated children, children being brought out of London because it was going to be safer in Cambridge than London. Those children came to Cambridge and quickly went home. They arrived in motor coaches. Their mothers left them to the tender mercies of the students. Their mothers went back to London. Today, they went home. No, this is the evacuation that took place before war, but we'd forgotten about. Once war is declared, then those London evacuees are back. But some are saying that Cambridge is not to be the place to bring them. While it's recognised that Cambridge is to some extent a place likely to attract air raids, the government is proposing to send thousands of London children here. This is not right. We should not be welcoming children to Cambridge. There should be no influx of refugees into Cambridge from outside, rant the Cambridge Communist Party. With so many extra mouths to feed, then obviously that's adding to the impact of rationing. Rationing is going to be introduced first with those little tickets that you chopped up, and then those perforated ones you gave up, and then you start all the problems of rationing that's affecting all of Cambridge, both the residents in the Long Road and the residents in the East Road. But if you're going to have rationing and you're going to need food, then that food has to be grown, and London girls come up to Cambridge University, or at least to Cambridge University Farm, to practice for the war work that they're going to undertake, just as their forebears had done during the Great War. While women flocked to Cambridge, in Cambridge, so many of the university people disappear. Many of the dons disappear from Cambridge. They've got skills. The archaeologists who used to working in Egypt and Greece will give advice on that part of the world. The mathematicians will go to places like Bletchley Park, wherever or whatever Bletchley Park was. A number of undergraduates join up to the forces. Others stay on to continue their courses. But Cambridge as a university welcomes new students, evacuated students from St Martin's School of Art or St Bart's. Cambridge is an education place and its facilities are used. While students from outside Cambridge are flocking to Cambridge and evacuees from London are being brought to Cambridge, then the Lees School leaves Cambridge for Scotland because its premises are going to be needed as an adjunct to Addenbrooke's Hospital, as they had in the First War. Other groups are coming up for education at Cambridge, military groups undertaking training at the various colleges, just as they had in the First War. But there's another group of people who are turning up in Cambridge, some of whom are in uniform and some of whom aren't. They're based in a house on the Chesterton Road. They seem to be civilians, and this would be a very interesting picture should you be a German spy, because these are the men and women who were going to run the eastern counties under the regional commissioner in the event of London being invaded and the central powers being lost. These are the people from St. Regis who are going to undertake the looking after of bombing raids, and there's bombing raids in, say, Norwich. Then these are the people who are going to organize. Yeah, if you were a spy, then these faces would be very important to you. Meanwhile, reminders of old wars, like this old field gun in Tennyson Road, were taken away to dispose of for scrap to make new guns. And people were collecting for war weapons weeks with a display of this Messerschmitten in the Corn Exchange in 1940. But of course, we are very aware, just as in the First War, that any attack on Cambridge is likely to come from above. And as in the First War, it is essential that we have a blackout. But how do you black out a place like Cambridge? Yes, you can turn the street lights off, but looking from above, how can you disguise King's College Chapel? How can you disguise the Great Court of Trinity? A blackout is introduced. The mayor is badly injured when he's run over by a car whilst inspecting the blackouts. Cambridge prepares for war. This is March the 3rd, 1939, before war is declared, and permanent air raid trenches are being dug on Midsummer Common between Auckland Road and the Brunswick School. But the Communist Party say this is not worth it. It is not right. It is not going to be efficient. We need an underground air raid shelter on Market Square. If we dug an air raid shelter under Market Square, we could also use it for an underground car park, said the Communist Party. But we have to prepare for war, but we know there's going to be no danger of Cambridge at war. We have to take precautions. We have to put tapes on our windows and sandbag the walls just in case of bomb damage and splinter damage. And you can't sandbag the walls of King's College Chapel. So the windows of King's College Chapel, the glass is removed and the windows are boarded up. The glass is taken away and hidden because they don't want the glass to be damaged in the event of an air raid. Although people do say, well, what's the use of the glass if the chapel's bombed? Here, the great window at the end of King's is covered with a swastika as German troops jackboot their way down King's Parade. Here on Market Place, men are being lined up in front of machine guns. But this is just propaganda. This is just imagine this. Imagine this in your marketplace. It's one of those attempts to ensure that we collect, that we are aware of the crisis. But of course, that very nearly became true. The headlines for June the 1st are positive. The headlines in papers have to be positive. More shiploads of troops arrive, the RAF bags 75 more Nazi planes. But of course, the headline is done Dunkirk. Now, it was remarkable that we got so many men off the beaches of Dunkirk, but they came back with little apart from what they could carry. France had fallen. Oh, the Germans are suffering enormous losses. It's great work by the RAF, say the papers of May the 15th. But the reality is that France has fallen and we will be next. There is a rush to join the LDV, the Local Defence Volunteer Corps, quickly called the Look, Duck and Vanish, the Lads' Army. Those old men and young boys are going to turn out and defend Cambridge to the last man, to defend the Mill Road. And how are you going to defend the Mill Road? Well, you can dig a tank trap around the outside, but how do you defend the Mill Road should German tanks make their way down? Well, they had a plan. If the Germans are coming down, what we'll do is we'll let the first one over Mill Road Bridge and we'll let the second one over Mill Road, and then we'll run out in front of the third one and I'll put an anti-tank mine on the road in front of him. You ain't got no anti-tank mines. Yes, I know that, but I've got a soup plate, and if I put the soup plate upside down, they'll think it's an anti-tank mine. You are making efforts and attempts to defend Cambridge to the last man and the last bullet, and the last defence will be around Cambridge's oldest defence point, the Castle Hill and Shire Hall. That is where the final rear guard battle would be fought. But that invasion is still to come. It hasn't happened. What has happened is what we were worried would happen. Air raids. 12 killed in big raids on England. 100 German bombers engaged. Civilians were killed when Germany opened its direct war on Britain during the night with extensive raids over eastern England. 9 of these people were killed when bombs hit a town and a row of houses in a town in Cambridgeshire. Can't say which one. It's censored, but you can give a list of the casualties. Heather Dear, 5 months, William Langley and Sam Langley. And as Cambridge people read those names, Cambridge people recognised those names. They were names of people that they knew in an area of Cambridge just off the East Road. And amongst those that lost their lives were children who had been evacuated to Cambridge because Cambridge was going to be safe. And amongst those who lost their lives were some of those ladies who had so proudly watched their sons and brothers marching off to war. Cambridge was to be bombed on numerous occasions. We are blessed in Cambridge that we have experts, and one of the experts is Michael Bowyer, and Michael Bowyer has researched Cambridge bombing because his dad was an air raid warden, and Mike was so keen on that from the earliest days. And he can tell you precisely where the bombs fell. He can tell you what plane dropped them, where they were aiming at. Cambridge is going to be bombed on various occasions, including on September the 27th, 1940, a famous cricket ground, Fenners. Now, reporting, of course, that was reported on the 27th of September, but on the 24th of September, one man was writing in his diary, because Jack Overhill kept a diary, Jack was a pacifist. He did not believe in war. He was a bootmaker who would not mend army boots. He did, however, keep a journal. This is Jack's journal. It was a hell of a night. There was a warning just before 9 o'clock, and we were in a shelter till midnight. As soon as we got to bed, the siren went again. And as the children had had little sleep, we thought we would keep abreast. We wish we hadn't. The all clear went at 2 o'clock. There'd been plenty of planes over, and I heard several explosions. And again, the thing there that Jack is making note of is that the sirens went off, and the sirens did go off. It frequently went off without bombs because planes were flying over. But this was the bombing raid that Germany had sent in reprisal for that raid on Heidelberg. Yes, the RAF had bombed Heidelberg, the German equivalent of Cambridge, before the raid. But of course, there had been raids, as we now know, on Cambridge before that. So it's gun propaganda, it is only partly true. The bombers are going to come back on various occasions. Everybody in Cambridge will remember the bombing on Mill Road Bridge. And I love this headline in the paper, "Bombs next door, but she carries on," referring to the lady who's continuing to do her cleaning, even though the house alongside is wrecked. They are being reported, the bombing raids, but the papers are censored. You don't get the details. It's going to be news that comes out a day or two afterwards. You have to know what you're looking before you find it. The bombers are going to come back. Later, the bombers are going to hit the center of Cambridge. They're going to drop bombs right beside the round church. They are going to badly damage the Union Society building, literally just across the road from St. John's College. You're going to have to report it, although not in too much detail. They're going to report also an East Anglian town's miniature fire blitz when a famous public school is damaged. You're not actually going to say that it's the Perth School, but people will know because you recognize it and you get the details of how the firemen's hose the water and the hose is going to freeze. And that is reported. But there was damage also to a Cambridge University building to Pembroke College. Pembroke College was badly damaged by fire. But that fire was not caused by enemy action. That fire was caused by a cigarette dropped by one of the military men who was billeted in Pembroke. You're going to see damage, like this damage on the Histon Road, when two ladies are going to lose their lives in the wreckage of a house. But that is caused by a crashed British bomber. In the same way that Jack is going to record a hurricane crashing in a lane near the Lensfield Road. Details that don't get reported. You don't report crashed hurricanes. Jack saw it. We aren't, of course, going to sit and wait for it to happen. We're going to take action, and anti-aircraft guns manned by the local Home Guard are going to be billeted around Cambridge. But the problem with anti-aircraft guns is that whatever you fire up into the air against the Germans is going to fall down again, and a shell falling back to earth can cause damage. So the anti-aircraft guns have a limited area on which they can fire. And of course, they know they can't hit the Germans. So what they do is fire box barrages, develop shells that explode around a plane and try and shake the plane out of the sky. That's the sort of thing that happened here when that plane suddenly turned up overnight on a piece of open ground just off the Scotland Road. You know what happened? You woke up in the morning, it'd have been not a bad night, you'd heard the sirens, but that always doesn't bother you too much now. And you take down the blackout curtains and you open the curtains and you look out and you're stretching and, mother, there's a German plane on the allotments at the bottom of our garden. That weren't there last night, was it? But blast, that's there now, overnight, without anybody noticing, not even the fire watchers on St. George's Church. A German plane had made a perfect landing on the only piece of open ground. I must divert because I've had an opportunity to talk to lots of wonderful people, and one of the talks that we gave was to a group of people with severe learning difficulties who met in the Mitchell Day Centre in Lensfield Road, Tennyson Road. And they didn't have a proper lecture theatre, you just talked to the corridor. And the people were saying, well, I've got problems, I have to wear headphones because of noises in my head, I can't sit still, I've got to keep walking about. And you say, that's fine, that's fine. So we're doing this talk and we got round to this picture and I'd just shown this plane, and in down the corridor came Ivor. And Ivor was an upright man, Ivor was an educated man, but Ivor was always talking. And he was always talking rubbish. Hey, diddly up, hey, up here. Hey, diddly up. He walked down the corridor, hey, diddly up, and he saw the picture. Hey, I saw that plane. Yeah, I lived in one of the houses there. My mum and dad and the whole room went quiet because Ivor was talking sense. Next week, hey, diddly. And again, what happened? Well, Michael Bowyer is the expert. Michael Bowyer can tell you because Michael Bowyer has met the man who flew this plane. The man who flew this plane says that he was tasked to bomb London. He went on a bombing run over his time. He was just a little bit out of sync and he had to turn around and go back again. As he went back again, his plane got hit in a box barrage and it shook the plane. It shook the plane so badly that it jammed the rudder. All he could do was fly round and round and round. He thought there's no sense in this and bailed out. As he bailed out, the plane was hit again in a box barrage. And this time it released the rudder. And as he dropped down on his parachute, he could see his plane flying away on its own. The plane ran out of fuel and made a perfect 3-point landing on the only piece of open ground off Chesterton. You'd hardly believe it, but it happened. The pilot drifted down and ended up in a field in Kent, where he was met by Grand Army girls and said, you didn't ought to be out here, my duck, don't you know there's an air raid on? He didn't want to say, well, I was the one that was causing the air raid. So he sat with them in the air raid shelter until the Home Guard recognised his uniform. Yeah. Detail that we get from Michael Bowyer. Cambridge, of course, has shelters. As we know, we have shelters in all the important places, like at Christ's Pieces, because at Christ's Pieces, people can perhaps make use of that bandstand for concerts. One morning, the policeman is going around doing his rounds, checking the air raid shelter, and there is a man that's sleeping. Come on, old mate, you can't sleep here. Come on, old mate, you can't sleep here. But he wasn't sleeping. He was dead with a bullet in the head. Going through his papers, they find that he was lodging at the Cambridge house. He went to see this landlady. They broke the news. Can I see his room? When they went to the room, they found a suitcase. When they opened the suitcase, they found a radio capable of broadcasting to Germany. The news of a German spy was hushed up. But what could such a spy have discovered? Why, of course, that Marshall's was doing great work on airfields, Marshall's on aircraft. Marshall's and its technicians were repairing aircraft and making them fit again. What could he have learned? Why, that the university engineering department was working on the hydraulics that enabled the guns of the planes to swivel, that the Cavendish laboratory in Free School Lane was doing work on all sorts of things, and that some morning some Frenchman had been seen walking down there with a suitcase containing heavy water, whatever heavy water was. That pies were no longer making television sets, but doing other work, including making shell fuses that would explode when they got to a certain height, so they could make the anti-aircraft shells explode around the bombers. And to test the robustness of their valves, they were dropping that down the lift shaft of the university library. Had the Germans taken out the university library, they could have claimed quite rightly that it was aiding the war effort. That on the Arbery Road, there was a Unicam factory, and the Germans would want to know, no, the Germans did know about the Unicam factory and the work that it was doing in all sorts of technological, because every time there was a plane in the area, they targeted the Unicam factory. They got so used to it that they didn't take notice of air raids. They had a man on the roof and he was watching, and only when he could see the planes coming would he shout down, and the girls would dive under their benches until the bombs had dropped. And then just a bit further down on the other side of the road, on Green End Road, amongst the newly built houses and trees, there were tents, because American troops were billeted there initially before they went to their camp on the Milton Road. We've skipped and we've darted as we must through the story of the war, but eventually the Americans are joining in. And leaflets are issued in Cambridge on how to cope with these new arrivals and their quaint ways. And of course, the Americans are bringing with them cameras, some of them loaded with color pictures, cameras that have film, and film is virtually unobtainable. So from the American eyes, we can get pictures of some of the cars with the headlight masks and the defense along Sydney Street. But the Americans, like all airmen, need somewhere to unwind, and where better than the Bung Hotel, which is between St. Catherine's College and King's College. And the Bung Hotel is taken over to become a Red Cross Services Club, a place where the Yanks can unwind. But of course, the Americans were not always welcomed. Jack in his diaries records, "Last night before going to bed, I walked a little way up Trumpington Road. I saw two married women whose husbands are in the army. They was walking along with two American soldiers. They was wasting one another, the heads of the women pillowing on the men's chests, and were obviously looking for a secluded spot. I returned home to bed, and just after midnight, these two women was parked outside our window and talking about what they'd got up to." Yeah, the arrival of the Americans was not always welcomed. But one day, an American is walking into the Red Cross and he bumps into a woman, a lady. Nothing about that apart from she was the first lady, the wife of the American president, who'd turned up in Cambridge at the Bung Hotel and welcoming the work that was done by the Women's Voluntary Service. That's surely something that the Germans would have liked to know. Surely if the Germans knew that the wife of the American president was in, it must be hushed up. Here is 1946, and two men who had some part in this war, Eisenhower and Montgomery, were here together in Cambridge. Together in Cambridge to receive honorary degrees, because by now the war is over and these are the people who have helped end that war. They are important that the university should recognize them. But of course, these men had been in Cambridge before. They'd been to that Union Society building, the one that had been wrecked. They hadn't been sightseeing, because hushed up at the Union Society in March 44, a most secret rehearsal for D-Day was carried out, with models of Mulberry Docks in the presence of Eisenhower and Montgomery. The Union Society was guarded by the army, the area controlled, something that the Germans must not know. Everything must be kept quiet. Everything that finds its way into a Cambridge paper is going to be learned about in Germany. It's got to be. So why, in May 44, are there big photographs of a record crowd saluting the soldier? Why, marching in front of the Fitzwilliam Museum, surely in all the Baedeker guides, are there pictures of servicemen? Why are there reports of famous service chiefs at Madingley? Well, it's of course for the dedication of the new Madingley military cemetery. But why publicize it? Why make such an effort to attract attention to it? Has it dawned on you that Madingley Cemetery was dedicated on D-Day? Or at least what was intended to be D-Day, except we know, of course, that D-Day was delayed. Was it proper propaganda to get Germany looking to Madingley and Cambridge and not on those invasion barges on the coast waiting to go? We know, of course, that D-Day was not the end of the war, but what was happening on in Africa and Italy and elsewhere marked a significant tide in the way that the war developed. And it also resulted in more prisoners of war, some of whom were billeted in a POW camp at Trumpington, where they put on plays in German to pass the time. And amongst the people who took part in those plays were Cambridge girls, because of course Cambridge ladies educated, they knew their German. D-Day was not the end, but it made a big impact. And eventually, and you can see that we have got to skip, eventually this is recognized by headlines. Headlines that proclaim the end. Hostilities end at midnight. The Channel Islands are free today. The King is giving a victory message. The German fleet is surrendering, and the front of the Cambridge Guildhall, that of course had never been formally opened because of the war, was decorated with the flags of the Allies. The war against Germany is over. We can have those street parties like this one in Beach Road, where that and that air raid shelter can form the basis of a place to take photographs of the Home Guard and the wardens and the people celebrating the end of that horrible war in Europe. But while the world celebrates the war in Europe, in Cambridge, it's a muted celebration, because many of the men of Cambridge who joined the Cambridgeshire Regiment and sailed off to war, had sailed off to war in India, but their ship had been diverted to Singapore. And they had arrived in Singapore just in time for that final defense against the Japanese invader. And then they had disappeared. Even when we were celebrating victory in Europe, we did not know what had happened to those men. There were rumors coming back of jungles. There were rumors coming back as camps. We didn't know where they were. We were fairly sure they weren't putting on plays with native girls. They were fighting the Japanese, and the war against Japan would go on and on and on until the headlines say Hiroshima. The headlines say all living things seared to death. Tokyo say the dead are uncountable. You can't now turn a page for the list of the casualties. But when you do turn the page, you learn that Cambridge was the real home of the atomic bomb. That early work had been done at the Cavendish. And that Frenchman with his suitcase of heavy water had smuggled it out of France before the Germans got hold of it. The work had moved from Cambridge to America because Churchill had been worried that Cambridge might be bombed. All of that, of course, is going to be very quiet and secret. But reports later are going to talk of atom bomb cases when people involved in work at the Cavendish are accused of passing on information. And a book is going to be published that says that one of Victor Rothschild, who was a government advisor who went round installations and advised their security, was reporting to the Russians. Oh, and that German spy, they don't think that he was a German spy. They think he was spying for the Russians. There's so much that didn't come out during the war and is still coming out or not coming out, and so much that is published and then disappears. Those men who had been in the jungle had lost their drums and they'd lost their flags. They were pleased to get back home. They were pleased to get back home and to be awarded the freedom of the borough of Cambridge as the Americans had a few months earlier. But miraculously, before that ceremony in Singapore, a nurse found their drums and flags. The drums and flags of the Cambridges were brought back to Cambridge and put on display in Joshua Taylor's until they were able to be reunited with those men. Many, of course, did not come home. And in Cambridge, in the Guildhall, a war memorial was unveiled with the names of the men of Cambridgeshire who had lost their lives. But also with the names of the ladies and children of Cambridge who had lost their lives in the bombing raids on Hills Road, Vicarage Terrace, and elsewhere. Those who came home may well have found that there was no home to come back to. But if they did and they had someone to come home to, then they wanted babies. And didn't they have them? Which is one of the reasons I'm here, I suppose. All of that is reported in the local papers if you know where to look. And of course, more is going to be reported after the war, because when that war is over, then the papers can tell you the things that they couldn't tell you at the time. They can tell you about the bombs which failed to explode. They can tell you where the bombs fell. They can tell you how the railways were coping with the Blitz. Those stories came out in 1945. But as time continues, then later over the years, new things come out. Some of the letters that was involved with that happening at St. Regis, some of the work that was being done on poison gas studies. Papers have a wealth of information. And although they're censored, we really can only help to understand a little bit of Cambridge by reading the papers day by day by day by day, which of course you can do in the Cambridge collection at Lion Yard Library. But you can also do it on whatever device you're watching this on, because on your device, you have copies of Cambridge papers, scores of Cambridge papers from 1890s through to the 1990s, including papers for 1940, 41, 42, 1943, 1944, 1945, 1946, not every paper, not every page of every paper, but over the last 20 years, I've gone through those papers looking for interesting stories between 1897 and 1990. And I've been taking photographs of those articles, or at least some of them, and they are on your device. You can literally just click picture by picture, page by page, 1955, 1956. It's a way of sharing information, and this is particularly relevant, of course, in this present time when so much of what we've had has been locked down. It's part of a massive amount of information that's there. It includes a Cambridgeshire scrapbook, but as well as a Cambridgeshire scrapbook, there is a Cambridge Chronicle, a 4,000-page summary of life in Cambridge from 1897 to 1990, not everything, but 4,000 pages worth. And they include a Cambridge military scrapbook. So it will summarize some of the events and tell you which paper they appeared in. And if I haven't copied it, then you can get it from the library. And that Cambridge is only part of a vast number of databases which are on your computer on the Internet Archive site. It is a way of sharing. And as you know, it includes a Histon scrapbook. Not everything that's happened in Histon, but some of the important things that happened in Histon. And I share all of this, as you probably know, on a Facebook group called Fenland History on Facebook. And if you're on Facebook, then take a look at Fenland History on Facebook. It's a place where people seek and share information. Just the other week, we had an email from a lady who said she was very interested in a Italian prisoner of war who'd worked on the fields in Hadnam. His name was Mario, and she really wanted, her mother had met him. She was first very interested in the impact of the war on Italian prisoners and what they did and where they were billeted and so she posted on Finland History on Facebook, and there now are about 40 or 50 people have responded. Yes, I knew him, or yes, I had other. It really is a wonderful way of sharing. We haven't, of course, summarized everything that happened, but we summarized a little bit of it, and I look forward to welcoming you to Finland History on Facebook.